Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take a look at some of the supporting files that go along with your introduction to HTML background. Specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at an HTML file, an XHTML file, an XML file. All three of the files represent different markup languages, although they are definitely related. I just wanted you to see the similarities and differences between the three approaches. Now, we're going to focus primarily on HTML, but it's very useful for you to understand the principles behind the markup language as we proceed, and specifically as you start working with HTML5 to sort of understand the evolution of HTML and the purpose behind these markup languages. So to begin with, I'm using Visual Studio. You just need to have an IDE that supports web development, and particularly it needs to support HTML and XML. Visual Studio has the added benefit of having this design view down at the bottom that allows for a split view between the code and a primitive rendering. I emphasize it's primitive because it's not exactly the way the browser is going to render your HTML, but it is good for development purposes. There are other ways to go about doing this, including plugins for VS Code and working directly in the browser. We'll take a look at those in other videos. For this video, I'm just going to focus on Visual Studio and quickly take a look at these three types of files. The first one you'll note here is going to be an HTML file. You'll notice the doc type up top, which doesn't really follow the rules that I emphasized in the earlier video of the opening and closing. You can sort of think of the doc type as somewhat of a preprocessor directive if you are familiar with C, although it isn't necessarily including anything. It's just telling the browser what to expect, much like the preprocessor directives give instructions to your compiler. In this case, the browser is told to expect an HTML document. After that, then we generally follow the pattern of the opening and closing tags. Although what you will see as you work with HTML, there are certain types of tags that are self-closing. Now, in this video, we're not going to spend a ton of time on individual tags. What we want to do is get familiar with the overall concept. And then the intention is that you sort of explore then the different tags and the order in which tags can be nested. You'll notice also too that I have this unusual tag here that indicates introduction to HTML background comment. You can see here that it is preceded rather by the angle bracket and exclamation point, and then closes then again with another angle bracket. This is the way that you indicate a comment in HTML. You can put them wherever you want to within your document. They're essentially ignored by your browser. It's just useful for you and for anyone else that might be reading your code. Continuing on, you'll notice the first significant tag is the HTML tag, which indicates that in this case, the language for this document will be English. The language or lang is an attribute. We once again will not focus too heavily on that in this video, but the idea is then that you can combine these HTML tags or elements with attributes. Of course, there are rules associated with which attributes go with which elements or which tags. And you'll notice here, this is the first tag that we've seen that now requires a closing tag. You'll notice that there is essentially what I will call the open HTML tag, and then the close HTML tag. And the idea is that you want to have these tags paired appropriately. You will see that there are certain tags that you can nest. The idea, though, is with the HTML tag that effectively it represents the root of your document, so you can only have one of those. And then the idea is that it sort of embodies or encapsulates the entire document in the document object model. And you'll also note that in some versions of HTML, it is actually not required. For our purposes, though, we are going to be consistent in keeping the HTML tag. The next tag that we want to look at is going to be the head tag, and you can see once again it too has an opening and a closing, and then nested inside of there is some additional information. The head tag are things that may not be displayed in the browser directly. You'll see that there are a number of tags that we will use within the head tag to give instructions to the browser, but the content inside the head tag won't be directly displayed in the browser. You'll understand the ambiguity in my statement there as you get further into HTML development. The one thing to note is the title tag inside the head, which is required for certain versions of HTML, is actually used to populate the tab in your web browser. Now, once again, that is somewhat of a choice, a rendering choice, you could say, but the idea is that inside the head, the information is not displayed in the browser, but of course, the metadata can be used then to make other instructions to the browser, and in this case, to display the information in the title in the tab associated with the browser. Moving on, we have a body tag, which once again opens and closes. And then inside of that, we will see there is a header tag. We will once again talk about some of these then later on. But the idea is I just wanted to have a nice looking header for our page, as well as a opening and closing paragraph tag. And then nested inside of that will be a line break BR tag. And notice that it is self-closing. And so the idea is then that is what allows for you then to put the next piece of data, or in this case, the next sentence, on the next line. Now, what you'll notice here is a couple things. Is there is some white space. I've tried to make this document nested appropriately. I did not do a perfect job of it. It's just out of habit that you simply leave, for instance, the body on the same level as the head and the HTML, although we could nest this in. The overall point being is that the spaces in between the tags are effectively for the humans, not for the browser. The browser knows to essentially ignore certain types of white space. A good example of this, for instance, is this white space in front of this first H in my first sentence. Certain types of white space are just flat out ignored. You'll see how you can add non-breakable white space in future videos. But the idea is then that it is the developer's responsibility to try to make the HTML code somewhat readable if the intentions for it are to be manually edited. If it's just simply being consumed by another resource or generated automatically or dynamically, then quite possibly you would remove the extra white space because it will make the file larger. But for our purposes, we're going to try to keep this relatively organized, relatively well organized. Now, moving on to the next document, this is actually an example of an XHTML file. First thing that you should note is that the doc type is different. And specifically, what you'll notice is that I'm trying to adhere to XHTML 1.1. You can see where the address is of the standard, or the DDT, which essentially is the rules governing XHTML 1.1. And basically what happens is that your IDE uses those rules then to determine the nesting order of your tags. The doc type basically tells the browser what to expect from the server, the browser being on your client, of course. And then inside of the HTML tag, we also have the address for the namespace for the XHTML. The idea is that generally speaking that these two should match, although we will see that there is some ability to add additional namespaces, particularly in the XML document that we'll see in just a second. There are some similarities between this XHTML and HTML document and some differences. You'll notice that I do not have the meta tag inside of the head. I do, however, have the title, which is, of course, a little bit different here. This is background number 2, so that will be displayed differently than in the name of the tab. But we open and close our head. We open or close our body, and we still have our self-closing tag for the line break, but pretty much everything else is relatively similar. You will notice that, again, as I mentioned, that you have some white space both within the tag definition itself, between the tags, and in between the tag opening and closing as well. So again, it is up to your browser to properly render and choose what white space to render and what white space to ignore. In some cases, the white space is just simply for the humans. Case in point, you could simply have this entire HTML document as one long string with no spaces other than the spaces that you intend between the words in the title, the header, and the paragraph, for instance. Moving on to XML, so you can sort of see the more primitive, I guess you could say, or depending on your point of view, the more constrained version of a markup language. Essentially, you can view it both ways, meaning that you have a lot of flexibility in XML. It's just you are the person that defines the document object model, or you or a group of developers. And the idea being is I'm trying to convey the exact same information that I conveyed in the earlier two files, the HTML and the XHTML. You'll, by the way, notice that both of the previous files had the same file extension. That was just for convenience. It is not a requirement. Technically speaking, the file name extension is only used on the computer to identify the file, or in your web server to identify the file. As long as you're streaming valid HTML, that's the purpose of the doc type, and prefacing then what document to the web client or web browser should expect. Likewise here with XML, it's just a common standard to use the .xml file extension. Although as long as you have in the contents of the document the XML version that you're planning to follow and the encoding that you expect to have in the document, then all is needed. You'll notice that I've went ahead and included this comment as well in this file, and then I open the document with a document tag. Now, the name of this particular tag is, well, quite frankly, kind of arbitrary. I've just decided to call it document. It could be more relevant to a piece of information that you might have, depending on what system you're trying to model, for instance. And then also too, I've created a XML and S or namespace for the XML. It specifies where to get the information about both the schema instance and also the schema location. And we'll talk about the schema in just a second, but fundamentally it sort of behaves like the DTD does, in that it gives the structure of your document. It also helps with the IDE, because then the IDE will know what rules to follow with recommending which tags can be nested within other tags. And as you'll see in just a second, how many instances of each tag to expect. This document tag opens and then closes at the bottom. You'll notice that I have spanned the opening tag over multiple lines. Again, the spaces are more for the humans. The processor will know what to separate and what not to separate. And I did this just simply so that it would fit all, since it wouldn't fit all on one line. So I just included a couple of new lines. I have arbitrarily included a title tag. Once again, the idea is I'm trying to make this as similar as possible to the HTML that you saw earlier. And in this case, I have a title tag that indicates then whatever application is going to consume this XML will know that that's supposed to be the title of this particular document. Now you can hopefully start to see the difference here in the different formats, different markup languages, and that I have now a contents tag. And then I have decided arbitrarily to sort of lump all of the information that would otherwise be in various cases in the HTML document. I've simply lumped them all into the contents and given them another tag called info. Hopefully you can start to see some of the more generic nature of XML. And the idea is that each piece of information has its own opening and closing tag, which means that I can have multiple pieces of information. And you've probably already figured out that I have now lost which piece of information is supposed to be the header and which piece of information goes in the body of the document. So again, you would want to probably think about some more refinement in your XML if that was the intention. And the idea here is I just want to show you a very primitive XML file and essentially how it relates back to HTML and XHTML. I close each one of the infos, I close the contents, and ultimately I close the document. Now, in Visual Studio, if you have created an XML file, you will have the ability to create the schema from the XML file. You kind of have a choice as far as what you want to start off with first. You create the structure of the XML file first, and then have to build the XML files afterwards, or do you build a sample XML file and then create the structure from a sample XML file? Doesn't really matter. Either are valid. But now you can see that the structure file or the XSD file is essentially yet another XML file. And we're not going to dig too deep into this. I just want to point out a few minor things here so that you can appreciate what's going on. You'll notice that buried in here, I have an element name called document. It is of type complex, in other words, meaning that it's nested. In other words, it has other features inside of it. And you'll see I do the same thing now for the title. For the title, however, I know that it is going to be a string, so I can specify that it is a string. The contents, as you saw, could have multiple pieces of info, and so as such will then be a complex type. And then you'll notice that down here under the info, I went ahead and emphasized that the maximum occurrence for a piece of information is unbounded. Effectively, what that means is that I can have as many pieces of information buried in my contents as I would like. Now, I can go back through and I can force some of these attributes, but again, the goal is not for us to delve too deeply into XML, but rather see then how you can have a forced structure on an XML file, just like you can an XHTML or an HTML file. Main difference is with the XML file, you or whoever you work with develops the rules, whereas in the HTML and XHTML, the rules are decided for you by the standards. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.